Definitely quite a feat to be able to talk about so many of the gains that have occurred over the last 10 years in the Venezuelan revolution. And Joe just focused on the education. I mean, we could have another 10 speakers talking about in the healthcare sector and in youth rights, in workers' rights and whatnot. But sort of what I wanted to focus my talk on was the recent referendum, what the referendum meant, what happened in the lead up to the referendum, and perhaps what may potentially happen in the next period in Venezuela. And I wanted to start off with just a little bit explaining the referendum itself. And what made me feel that this would perhaps be important to do was yesterday morning, as I was coming in from the airport, I did a radio interview with Radio Adelaide. And the presenter, I don't know them, but they definitely seemed very positive about Venezuela. And most of their questions were about, can you talk more about how great the revolution is? What is socialism of the 21st century? How the community are organising? But the way that she introduced the interview was to say, well, last Sunday Venezuelans went to the polls and just voted to make Chavez president for life. And I sort of, and then she said, and so this will be great for socialism, and so could you talk about socialism? And I sort of said, well, hang on, before we get onto that, perhaps it's just useful to explain exactly what it was that people voted for on Sunday. So I wanted, that's why I thought I'd start on that. The referendum itself was to reform 5 articles of the Constitution. And as a combined project would basically allow all elected officials to be able to restand as many times as they wanted as candidates in elections. Initially, the proposal was just to do that for the president, for the position of president, but that was in the course of the campaign was increased to allow all elected officials to do so. And this is, a pretty basic democratic right that, most countries, I mean, here in Australia, we definitely, coming from living in New South Wales all my life, I can certainly talk about people like Fred Nile from the, who's been in New South Wales State Parliament for way too long. And so the idea that somehow that now Chavez is eternalised for power. What we really saw is the ability now that in 2012 his mandate will finish. That was definitely not up for question on this referendum. His mandate will finish then, and then there will be another elections. And of course, if Chavez is pre-selected by his party, the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, which he has already announced that he will stand as a candidate for the internal elections. If he's pre-selected, he will be able to stand once again in the elections. But I also think that, and this is definitely true, that the referendum itself was much more than just simply a question of, can elected officials stand or not. And I think we can start to understand that when we see what occurred in the election campaign itself, who lined up on what sides, and what the campaign motives behind the yes and no bloc were on this particular referendum. Because really, what was definitely the real question was, do we want to continue to move forward with this process, with this revolution that is unfolding in Venezuela? Do we want to continue to push forward towards the socialism of the 21st century that Chavez has openly been talking about since 2005? I think we begin to see this when we look at why was this referendum called when it was. And I think it's impossible, I only have 15 minutes, so I can't talk about the 10 years of the revolution. So I'm going to try and maybe skim through the last sort of 2 years very quickly to give people an idea, at least my opinion, of why this referendum was called. And I think it's impossible to talk about this referendum without talking about the defeat of the first attempt to include that into the Constitution, amongst many others, which was the constitutional reform that was proposed by Chavez in late 2007. There was initially some 33 articles. Amongst them was the question of allowing re-election for candidates, but many of the other articles dealt with getting rid of some of the sort of old inheritance of the old constitution that had been inserted into the new one, which basically acted as barriers to be able to transfer power to the community. To give one example, I'm not going to give the example of all 69 articles, but just to look at one and what was really behind this constitutional reform. There's an article that still obviously exists in the Constitution on the basis that this referendum, the reform was lost, that says that public services can be transferred to the community, but only on the basis that the community have proven that they can do that. Now, of course, the problem that arises there is, firstly, who decides, who proves that the community can run that? And if they can't do that in the first place because the Constitution doesn't allow that, how do you prove that you can actually run those services? And so in many cases where communities were actively involved in, whether it was with their local schools, whether it was with the electricity in their local neighbourhoods, were denied the ability to be able to take further sort of decision-making power into their hands by local mayors who didn't want to see the power go to the community, who preferred to see it in their own hands. So this is what was really behind the reform. And for most people, I think on both sides of the political spectrum in Venezuela, were surprised when in December 2007 those reforms were defeated, narrowly, very narrowly, but defeated in the referendum. The opposition obtaining some 4.4 million votes, and the Chavistas, the people in favour of the revolution, getting some 4.2 million votes. Of course, this opened up a big discussion within those that supported the revolution, because after winning 9, 10 elections in a row, all of a sudden to lose an election was definitely something that made people think, well, what happened? What went wrong this time? Why was it that we so convincingly won all these other times, and then without us even knowing? And I would stress that also without the opposition knowing that they would win. And the evidence of that is the fact that by the end of the day, on the day of the referendum, I was in Venezuela at the time, the opposition had already begun to organise street demonstrations claiming fraud in the elections, because they just knew that they were certain they were going to lose, and so therefore they had to come out and say it was fraud. And then all of a sudden the news started coming out, no, actually you won. And it was like, so they weren't quite sure what to do in that situation. But so they were definitely as well just as shocked by the result. But this caused a very important discussion within the process as to what did this result mean. This discussion perhaps did not go on for a very long time for a number of reasons. I think one of the important reasons being because after several weeks of this discussion, Chavez himself assumed personal responsibility for the defeat. He said, I was the one that proposed it, I did it at the wrong time, I assume responsibility. And this was part of, I think, because of where the discussions, the level of tensions of the discussions were going, that Chavez felt that what was necessary was, rather to focus on that, was to focus on the strengthening the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, the PSUV, which had only come into formation. But I think the discussion really could be categorised into two broad blocks. And they were expressed very publicly, both sides of these positions, by everyone from local grassroots members of the party to people in the government and in the ministries. The first one was that the people weren't ready for socialism, that perhaps we had probably advocated going a little bit too far, and that the people weren't really prepared to do that. And what we needed to do was just to slow everything down and re-convince people of the need for it. And I think another wing, the other wing of the debate, was what we needed to do was, on the one hand, consolidate what we had, that we needed to fix up some problems. We all recognised there was problems. No one in Venezuela says it's perfect, so we should recognise that as well and fix those problems. But in order to do that, it meant that we needed to continue to move forward with this process. That this wasn't a reflection that people were against Chavez, they weren't against socialism, but what they needed to be done was to be brought back into the equation, brought back into political activity. That, again, I can't go into the other years of the revolution, but certainly you can imagine that going from an intense period of political struggle to defeat a coup attempt, to defeat a two-month bosses lockout across all the major sectors of industry, to mobilise for a recall referendum to ensure that Chavez would stay in power. After 3 years of that intense struggle, people definitely were in for a little bit of calm time and just getting on with sort of business as usual. The government moved very effectively, in my opinion, to start to tackle some of these very important issues facing the revolution. Particularly, I would say that some of the issues that were very quickly dealt with were things like the issue of food shortages that were very rampant in 2007 and today once again reappearing, but definitely not on that scale. Also moved to tackle the issue of crime. Not sure if people had a chance to see a couple of nights ago on SBS, they showed a Venezuelan film, Secuestro Expreso. Gives you, if you ever get a chance, you get a little bit of an idea of what it's like in Caracas. This is what Joe was mentioning, sort of crime definitely in Caracas in Venezuela has become an issue, but the government has begun to tackle that. And this I guess, re-winning of confidence